We are on page 153, reading about Isabel. Somewhere on the Straits of Florida, 1994, 2 days from home. Rain lashed Isabel as she shoveled water out of the boat. Scoop, pitch, scoop, pitch. The bottom of the boat filled as fast as they could bail it out. Isabel, her mother, her father, her grandfather, Louis, Ivan, Senor Castillo, they all worked feverishly, none of them talking. Not that they could hear each other over the storm. The only ones not bailing were Senor Castillo, who looked like a ghost, and Amara, who clung to the rudder with white-knuckled hands and tried to keep the boat turned into churning waves so it wouldn't capsize. The engine hadn't worked since their escape from the tanker. The storm clouds turned the day into night, and the driving rain soaked Isabel to the bone. She shivered in the cold wind, her feet numb in the water sloshing at the bottom of the boat. Sea spray stung her eyes, and in between scoops of water she dragged her arm across her face, trying to wipe away the saltwater tears. As she watched the surging wave, Isabel remembered the last time she had seen her Ambielita, her grandma. She remembered Lita's hand reaching out to help her as the tide swept her away. Isabel had been 9 years old. Her parents had sent her to stay with Lito and Lita as their little shack on the coast. They hadn't said why, but Isabel was old enough to know her parents had been fighting again, and they wanted to be alone while they worked things out. All that spring, Isabel had waited without joy in the ocean, waiting for the storm to come that would tear her family apart. And then the real storm had come. It wasn't a hurricane. It was bigger than a hurricane. A gigantic cyclone that stretched from Canada down through the United States and across Cuba and into Central America. Later, they would call it the storm of the century. But to Isabel, it was the storm. The shrieking wind ripped roofs off houses and pulled palm trees straight out of the ground. The rain fell sideways. Hail shattered windows like never-ending shotgun blast. And the ocean rose up like a giant hand and reached inland over Lito and Lita's little house by the sea, smothering the house in its giant paw and dragging the shattered pieces back to its lair. Lito and Lita hadn't even known the storm was coming, or they wouldn't have been there. They would have been inland, found higher ground. Castro had promised he would protect them. But he didn't. Not then. Not Isabel's grandmother. Lito had been able to hold on to Isabel, but Lita had been swept away. She had slipped under the waves, her arms still reaching for Lito, for Isabel. And that was the last day they had seen her. Lito's arm found Isabel again now and wrapped her in a hug. "I know what you're thinking," he said close to her ear where she could hear him. "I'm thinking about it too." "I miss her," Isabel told her grandfather. "I miss her too," Lito said. "Every day." Real tears came to Isabel's eyes now, and Lito hugged her tighter. "That was her song's end," Lito whispered, "but ours plays on. Come, keep bailing, or soon it'll be up to our eyeballs." Isabel nodded and went back to scooping water. What if her life was a song? No, not a song. A life of symphony, with different movements and complicated musical forms. A song was something shorter, a smaller piece of life. This journey was a song, Isabel realized, a son cubano, and each part of it was a verse. The first verse had been the riot, a blast of trumpets, the rat-tat-tat of a snare drum, then the pre-chorus of trading her trumpet for gasoline, the piano that gave the sun its rhythm, and then the chorus itself, leaving home. They were still leaving home, still hadn't got to where they were going. They would return the chorus again and again before they were done. But what about the refrain, and how many more verses would there be before they got to the climax in the song, that brash moment at the end of the song cubano that echoed the refrain, and then the coda, and then those brief few notes that all tied together? She couldn't think about that now. All she could do was scoop water and pray they didn't drown in the mad cogno solo that drummed against the side of their tiny metal boat. Mahud, somewhere on the Mediterranean Sea, 2015, 11 days from home. The cold water was like a slap in Mahud's face. Before he could think, he gasped, sucking in the mouthful of the dark Mediterranean Sea. He tumbled backward, head down in the murky water, his arms and feet thrashing, trying to help himself. Something else fell on top of him, pushing him deeper down into the water. He choked, coughed, swallowed more water. Bodies tumbled into the water above him, beside him, below him. His knee struck something hard and sharp, a rock, and he felt a cold flash of pain that quickly disappeared into blind, senseless terror. He was drowning. The rubber dinghy had burst against the rocks, and he was drowning. Mahud kicked, paddled, flailed. His face came out of the water and he gulped down there, and then a wave washed over him and again he went down. He kicked his way back to the surface and fought his head to keep above water. "Mom! Dad!" Mahood cried. His yells were mixed with screams and cries and the other passengers who had made it back to the surface. All around Mahood, survivors thrashed and gasped. There was nothing left of the dinghy. The engine had dragged the rest of it down. Mahood saw something bobbing along the water, glowing. A cell phone! It was still sealed tight in the plastic bag. The air in the bag kept it afloat. Mahood swam for it, ducking a wave and pawing the bag into his arms. The glowing phone screen said 2:32 a.m. Help! Help! Mahood's mother sobbed, her voice recognizable in the chaos. Mahood spun, oriented himself, and frog-kicked his way through the waves toward the shape he thought was his mother. He picked her pink-head scarf out of the swirling pandemonium and saw that she was fighting to lift something out of the water. Hana. Mahood swam to his mother. Hana was crying. She was alive, but it was all Mahood's mother could do to keep the baby and her own face above the relentless waves. One or the other of them was going to drown. Mahood put his arms around his mother and tried to kick her and Hana both to the surface, but half the time he felt like he was dragging them down with him. Fatima! Mahood! He heard his father cry. Mahood turned to see his father with Lalid in his arms. The life preservers are useless! He roared. His head appeared to be disappearing behind the waves. They're fakes! Fake? Mahood was furious, but his anger quickly faded. Every ounce of his energy was focused on kicking and swimming. If he stopped, he and his mother and sister would drown. There were other people around, yelling, searching, fighting to stay afloat, but as far as Mahood was concerned, his world was 4 meters round. Where did they go from here? How did they get out of the sea and onto dry land? They were lost in the stormy Mediterranean Sea in the middle of the night. Their dinghy was sunk, and though he had run into rocks, there wasn't any hand in sight. They were going to die here. All of them. Mahood's breath breathed in seawater through his nose and hacked it up. He fought to breathe, the waves lapping over him and the rain and the spray still lashing his face. But his baby sister's cry refocused him. He could not lose her. He couldn't lose any of them. They came together in the water, Mahood and his mother and father, all with them helping Hana and Walid and each other stay afloat. Other families and groups did the same, but eventually the little groups drifted apart from each other, none of them knowing which way they were supposed to go. All they could do was stay on top of the next wave, and the next wave. Kick off your shoes, Mahood's father told them. Anything will lighten you. Time passed. The rain stopped. The waxing moon even peeked out from behind a cloud, but just as quickly as it was dark again, and the cold wind and the salty spray and the swelling sea tormented them. Mahood's legs were numb with cold and exhaustion. They felt like 2 lead weights he struggled to lift and churned to stay afloat. His mother had been quietly sobbing for what seemed like forever. Her arms no longer held Hana above the water, but just on top of it, like she was pushing along a tiny barge. Mahood's father did the same thing with Walid, trying to save his strength. Hana had gone as quiet as Walid, and Mahood wondered if they were still alive. He couldn't ask. Wouldn't. If he didn't ask, you couldn't know for sure. As long as he didn't know for sure, there was a chance they were still alive. Mahood slipped beneath the waves once more, longer this time. It was getting so hard to come up again, to keep himself afloat. He rose again, pushing air out of his nose, but he was so tired, very tired. He wished for a respite from swimming, but a moment to sit without working his arms and legs, to close his eyes and go to sleep. Water was sloshing in and out of Mahood's ears, but he thought he heard a drone just above a howl of the wind. In Syria, that sound would have sent him ducking for cover, but now made his eyes widen, his legs kick just a little harder, a little higher. There, coming at them out of the darkness, another dinghy full of people! Mahood and his mother and father waved their arms and cried for help. At last the people on board saw them, but as the dinghy came closer, it didn't slow down. They weren't going to stop? The front of the dinghy chopped past Mahood, and he lunged for one of the handholds on the side. He caught it, grabbed his mother before the dinghy pulled him away. He swung Mom to the side of the dinghy, and she grabbed hold, and in the wake of almost swamping Hana. Behind them, Mahood's father also reached for the dinghy, but missed. It churned along, bouncing in the chop, and Mahood's father and brother disappeared into the darkness. Dad! Mahood cried, still holding onto the dinghy. Let go! A woman said. You're dragging on us! Let us in, please, Mahood begged. It was all his mother could do to hang on to the dinghy and to Hana. We can't, there's no room, a man inside yelled. Please, he said, we're drowning. I'll call the Coast Guard for you, a man said. I have their number on my phone. Another man reached down and tried to pry Mahood's hand from the dinghy. You're tipping us! Please, Mahood cried. He sobbed with the effort of fighting off the man's fingers and hanging. Please, take us with you! No room! At least take my sister, Mahood's begged. She's a baby. She won't take up any room. That caused much yelling and discussion on the boat. Ahmad tried to pry Mahood loose again, but he hung on. Please, Mahood begged. A woman appeared at the side of the boat, her arms reaching down to Mahood's mother, reaching for the baby. Mahood's mother lifted the little ball of wet blankets to the woman. Her name is Hana, she said, struggling to be heard above the roar of the engine. Someone finally pried Mahood's fingers off the side, and he slipped into the water and tumbled in the dinghy's wake. When he came up, he saw his mother had let go of the dinghy, too. She was crying great howling tears and tearing at her clothes. Mahood swam over to her and wrestled her hands into stillness, and she put her head on Mahood's shoulder and sobbed. Mahood's sister was gone, and so were his father and brother.